Welcome, everyone. I'm going to try to do a couple things today. I'm going to start with the discussion, since we're talking about the current situation in Turkey and Syria, and I want to tie it to the broader issue of activism and engagement, because also this is a gathering of activists, and I want to advance an argument that has to do with engaged activism. And to do that, I would like to essentially use the current situation on the Turkish-Syrian border as an example of how our activism, if just left to pursue whatever is available in terms of policy, can actually be problematic. What I mean by that is this. Typically, when we think about and when we talk about activism, regardless of the content, of the nature of it, it is important, it's absolutely important to think about collaboration, working with other groups. This is a grassroots conference, right? The importance of being part of horizontal movements, intersectionality, etc. But oftentimes, in this kind of engaged activism, it's also important for us to have an informed engagement. I say this because in the past couple of weeks, I've seen a number of opportunities where our focus on the Armenian genocide and the way in which the Armenian genocide has been instrumentalized by others involved in this conflict has been very worrisome to me from my perspective. So what I'm going to do today is first start with a very quick overview of the situation on the ground. We're happy to discuss this further during the Q&A. And then I'm going to go into this argument, this point about discourse, this point about informed activism, right? In terms of not just following whatever is out there in solidarity with whatever is by default anti-Turkish, but also trying to shape the discourse and narrative around issues of justice and human rights, as opposed to taking positions that are by default on this or that side. So this is probably the central argument I'd like to advance here, and you'll see how it's going to be connected to some of the developments on the ground today. I'd like to start with a general overview of the current situation. As you all have been following over the past couple of weeks, the situation over the Syrian-Turkish border has deteriorated strikingly. You have an invasion. There has been a lot has been said about here in the United States about President Trump's policies, how he capitulated to the Turkish president, and how this cascaded a series of events that has brought us to this point today, where there is a ceasefire that may or may not hold in the next couple of days. There's a situation where that is being presented as a victory and success for everybody, for the Kurds, for the Turks, for the Americans, and for civilization, while at the same time on the ground we realize that the Turkish military and the Turkish state has largely accomplished a number of its important priorities, right? And so in this kind of environment, there's a few arguments that are being placed out there at the level of the US that I would like to say a few words about. The first is this notion that we've heard over and over again over the past couple of weeks, which is that we have stabbed the Kurds in the backs. They are our allies. They were fighting on our side, and now we have abandoned them. And how is the world going to trust the United States moving forward? How are we going to be able to find allies around the world going forward? This is the first argument that we've heard over and over again. And clearly, I do not think many people disagree with the notion that there was a very clear tactical or strategic, depending on who you ask, mistake that was made on that phone call and in the days that followed by the Trump administration. Yet, portraying this issue as one where, as if the United States or any of the United States allies or any country in the world has never ever put down any ally anywhere. And the fact that, and to think that just because of this particular development, other groups, other countries are not going to join forces with the United States moving forward is not really a very tenable argument. So it's one of those things that we say and we repeat, but ultimately, we all know that that's not how politics works. We all know that it's not like suddenly the United States was on a particular pedestal and this particular policy decision completely, trampled everything, right? Destroyed everything. And therefore, the situation is a lot more nuanced, right? On the ground, is it true that the Kurds and in general, the Syrian Defense Forces were handed a terrible situation? Yes, absolutely. Is it true that the consequences of this situation is going to ultimately lead to ethnic cleansing in the region? Yes, absolutely. Is it true that this has given a lot more room for Russia and other countries to have greater influence on the situation on the ground? Yes, absolutely. But again, creating these broad narratives that really are difficult to sustain, things saying like, just because the United States did this, nobody's going to trust us moving forward, is quite similar to saying that just because the United States does not recognize the genocide, other genocides took place after that, right? These are things that are good to say, and they're used as arguments, but if you really pause for a second and think about it, it's not something that can withstand critical evaluation. After the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust took place, and people did say never again, and there were reparations, and there was justice, and still there have been genocides since. Right? So acknowledging one particular genocide does not necessarily mean that there's another that's going to be prevented. My suggestion is that there's the similar kind of discourse, again, staying in the context of the Trump administration. The news reports that came over the past couple of days came out about how the Trump administration was also considering using the Armenian genocide recognition as a tool in this process is also telling, right? In the way in which the genocide issue is instrumentalized, in the way in which the genocide issue is weaponized in the United States and beyond. So I want to pause and reflect on this a little bit. Clearly, as activists, as Armenian Americans, we realize that no government, at least we hope we realize, that no government is actually going to make decisions purely on some kind of moral foundation, right? And in that sense, the United States will recognize the Armenian genocide when when the government essentially finds itself or Congress in a place where it sees this as a politically expedient development fact alongside the moral argument, right? So this is important to keep in mind. Now, the problem is how to navigate this as activists, how to think about this as activists. So this is the challenge that has been posed by the Trump administration and the current tension in Turkey, on the Turkish-Syrian border. I would argue that a similar instrumentalization and weaponization of the genocide is going on elsewhere in the general discourse. And this is particularly bothersome to me. And this is the discussion that situates this general repeated notion that another Armenian genocide is going to take place or is taking place or is unfolding in northern Syria. We have heard statements like this from the Kurdish leadership. We have heard statements like this from the Syrian Kurdish leadership. We have heard statements like this from politicians and others. Regardless of who the target of this kind of accusation is, right, Turkey, and regardless of how we position ourselves towards Turkey's policies, it's sometimes important for us to pause and think about the problems with this kind of discourse. And here I want to take a step back and think about how progressive activism operates, how intersectional activism operates. When we are engaged in a certain kind of activism and we meet and encounter another group that is also pushing for another progressive agenda, we try to learn from them about how to talk about their issues. Let's think about gender, for example, right? You know, we do not engage on issues of gender with the same language that we used to employ 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Now, the Armenian genocide is not any different than other issues on which, you know, you have coalitions that are forming. Coalitions between progressive groups, between, you know, Kurdish groups, Armenian groups, Turkish groups, you name it. It is important in this kind of context to not take just any statement that mentions the Armenian genocide as some kind of victory for the recognition of the Armenian genocide. When someone says what is going on right now in northern Syria is a repetition of the Armenian genocide, my first reaction is, do we know what happened during the Armenian genocide? It's quite problematic. And it is our role as allies, progressive activists, as grassroots organizers who are working together with other groups to actually make this point, to actually push for an argument that really is very careful with this. Note that I'm not saying that what is happening in northern Syria right now is not ethnic cleansing. I'm not saying that what's happening in northern Syria right now might not devolve into genocide. What I'm saying is that taking into account the history of the Armenian genocide and its denial, and the consequences of the loss and dispossession of the Armenian people of their land and property and everything they have in historic Armenia, for groups to articulate the issue of the Armenian genocide and instrumentalize it, and use it in this kind of battle, and for us to not make that corrective step, and point to the fact that, you know, what is happening in northern Syria is not a genocide. It may become a genocide, but it's definitely not the Armenian genocide with its scope and the level of dispossession and destruction and annihilation and the erasure of an entire group of people. It is important for us to really make this argument and make this point. And this is important for us. This is the distinction I see in my mind in terms of the difference between activism, which just follows whatever is being said just because it's anti-Turkish, or activism that is informed. Activism that is trying to set an agenda alongside, you know, trying to follow an agenda that has a particular orientation. Again, I understand the importance of politics. I understand the importance of being galvanized by a particular moment and trying to see how that moment can be directed in this or that sense. However, at the same time, it is important to think about issues like the Armenian genocide and its consequences in a different context. It is important to realize that when we use the term genocide to refer to other cases, or others use it to instrumentalize and weaponize the Armenian genocide, to use the victims of the Armenian genocide in order to make another point, right? It's important for us to have a corrective approach. It's important to us to be more proactive in the way in which we engage in our discourse with these issues. Because this is what helps. This is how we learn. This is how I have learned from other activists about a number of other issues. This is how I have changed my language when I think and talk about gender issues, when I think and talk about LGBTQ issues, when I think and talk about Native Americans and slavery, etc. And in all of this, we have an important role to play. Ours is not just the role of engaging in activism, ours is a role of engaging in activism while at the same time shaping discourse. A discourse where the Armenian genocide, the moment the Armenian genocide is weaponized and is being used in a context where it does not work, it is our role to actually point out to it. If we don't, if we just take whatever is out there and consider it a victory to, you know, mentioning or recognizing the Armenian genocide, right? There are implications and consequences to this. This is crucial. This is not something, you know, the current situation on the Syrian border, Turkish border, regardless of what the outcome of the ceasefire is not something that's going to go away, right? And it's important as we reflect on the road ahead to really approach this kind of discourse in a different manner. it is important for us to realize that when there is this issue of instrumentalizing and weaponizing the genocide, we got to be very careful. The same thing happens with Azerbaijan, by the way. You know, Azerbaijan, the Azeri government loves employing the term genocide to refer to Khojaly. As a response, we've had many Armenian government leaders, representatives, use the term genocide for Sumgait, right? And suddenly genocide becomes this term that we're using left and right, about a number of events. Now, it's important to be mindful of the fact that in this kind of battle, ultimately, one thing is important for us to be mindful of, that what is the Armenian genocide that we keep comparing everything to is ultimately becoming. Let me give an example to explain this. The Turkish government today acknowledges that there were deaths that happened. You know, some denialists will say up to 300,000 Armenians were killed, right? But it was not genocide. Oftentimes, our discourse about the Armenian genocide is about how the Turkish state, the Turkish government relativizes, diminishes the importance of, or the significance of, or the enormity of the Armenian genocide. But it's important for us not to do the same. It's important to us to not inadvertently, right, compare the Armenian genocide to everything. And believe me, I'm mindful of the similarities and the parallels. My entire work focuses on Syria. And it focuses on 100 years ago what was happening in Syria during the Armenian genocide. And I see every single day in the news, references to Ras Al Ain, references to Deir Zor, just like many of you do, references to Raqqa, places where the Armenian genocide essentially was brought to a conclusion, places where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And yes, I see the tremendous suffering, and I see the tremendous movement, forced movement of populations in the region. And it's shockingly, horribly similar. But it's also important, ultimately, for us to think about these in different terms as well. For us to be mindful of the general, have a better appreciation of what is going on the ground. And when we sense that certain characterizations require more clarification, more nuance, for us to be forthcoming about it. As good allies, as good comrades, as good supporters, as good grassroots activists, as good engaged, informed individuals who are not just following a particular call to intervention or some kind of just battle or war, but also in terms of a group of people who are trying to set an agenda that is mindful of the fact that just using the term Armenian genocide and comparing it to everything that is going on is problematic on many levels, right? And so this is the main gist of the argument that I would like to advance. Now it's important to say, just as I try to conclude here, that there's a lot on the ground that is worth for us to pause and reflect on, which is why I say, no matter what happens tomorrow and in the coming days related to the border with Syria and Turkey, right? These are important tools for us to reflect on and to utilize moving forward. One is that there's a tremendous battle of in the arena of fake news that's trying to smear the Kurdish led campaign in Syria, right? Only yesterday there was this news on one of the Syrian opposition TV channels saying that the Kurds had actually confiscated an Armenian church in Tel Afar and converted it into their headquarters, and there were photographs of Abdullah Öcalan on the walls, and one of the rooms of the church had been converted into a prison, right? There was video footage of this, and it was being circulated all over. Turns out that actually the people who were filming that film posted those pictures on the walls. The whole thing was done purposely to target and discredit and undermine the Kurdish effort in the region, right? So there's a lot of propaganda out there that is trying to muddy the waters in the first place. And in situations like this, again, an approach that really is mindful of what is going on the ground and tries to engage with the challenges and the problems on the ground is the healthiest way forward. There are problems with the Kurdish presence in northern Syria. There have been in recent months and couple of years, actually, particularly with the Syrian community, and also a little bit with the Armenian community and other Christian communities. But these are problems that sometimes make it to the news, but they're not part of our thinking. They're not part of our conversations with our Kurdish activists and other counterparts. On the other hand, again, just let's reverse this, turn things around. Let's think about scenarios where we try to mischaracterize another one of our allies or groups or partners' causes or issues. First of all, how much of a problematic aspect that is, and how much of a problem that engenders from the other side, right? Just think about any of the issues that we may or may not, we may be very much involved in and caring about. Again, things that have to do with slavery, reparations for Native Americans, issues related to refugees these days, detention centers, etc., right? We really try to be careful in the way we think about this. We try to parse what is true from what is not, and we really try to be mindful of the situation, the way we're characterizing the other group that we're trying to stand in solidarity with. And oftentimes, we stand in solidarity with that group based on their terms, because that is what we as outsiders are supposed to do. When people are standing in solidarity with us on the issue of justice for the Armenian genocide, the same rule applies. It's important for us to point to problematic discourse when this discourse is one that neglects the rights of Armenians, wherever they are, on this planet, neglects, challenges, or misrepresents the Armenian genocide, the Armenians' quest for justice, and it's important for us to really try to correct and rectify that, not just for our own sake, for the sake of any kind of coalition that is built to last, any kind of because ultimately, in the 21st century, right, issues and problems are not going to be resolved just by the agenda, particularly for groups that are, small groups and nations and causes around the world. It's not going to be something that we're going to be carrying alone on our own. We will need partners, but we will need partners who are going to be informed, and therefore we just can't be activists alone. We have to be informed activists. Thank you very much.
I'll speak from here, if it's okay, save some time. First, I just want to follow up on, because that's very important to put everything in context, what Hachik said about our connection to what's going on in Syria today, both from our collective memory, our souls. So it's beyond the comparisons of the genocide. There's a lot that hits the Armenian soul with what we witness. But we must, again, take that with some degree of objectiveness and logic. But I want to start reading, because these cities that he mentioned, where a lot of the occupation is occurring and the injustices are being done, are mentioned. And in a report from Consul Rösler at Aleppo on January 3rd, 1916, during the Armenian genocide, just very short. A German engineer who was engaged during the decisive events on the construction of the Baghdad Railway at Rasul Ain and Tel Abyad, two cities you see in the news every day, and who is wholly trustworthy, has provided moving reports which make it possible to realize the conscious and deliberate extermination of the deportees by Turkish government agencies. What he saw, the ally of Ottoman Empire at the time, is what we believe we're seeing all over again, and that's why the Armenians play a special role here. Now, my role here, as I have two hats. One, because we are providing a continuing legal education service through the Armenian Bar Association, I have to talk to you about the law that applies to the Turkish invasion of Syria, and I'll gladly do so. It's a little dry, so please bear with me. And we were supposed to be before lunch, and now we're after lunch, so that doubles my task in intensity. Well, Turkey's main defense before the Security Council as to what it has done is premised on Article 51 of the UN Charter, and I will read it. Nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of the individual or collective self-defense in an armed attack, if an armed attack occurs against a member state of the United Nations, until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. Measures taken by the member states shall be immediately reported to the Security Council and shall not in any way affect authority and responsibility of the Security Council under the present Charter to take at any time such action as it deems necessary in order to maintain or restore international peace and security. There's a lot there, but the key word was self-defense, right? Which justifies it as an exception to the overall Charter, which says we got to have peace and we don't attack each other. And the second key word was if an armed attack occurs. That's the literal reading of the Charter. Well, even though that's the case, and you probably know those who are lawyers and others, even in the US Constitution, we have judges who interpret it broadly, they call them strict constructionists. So if you were a strict constructionist, you'd say right off the bat, Turkey violated the Charter because there was no armed attack on Turkey. Well, the other group of scholars, let's call them the more liberal interpreters, not in the political sense, but in the reading of a statute sense. Well, if they take it as if there was an imminent armed threat to sovereignty, political independence, and security, that justifies self-defense. Well, whereas the YPG or PYD, then in that case, were they an imminent armed threat to Turkey? Well, that's not defined anywhere because, again, this is interpretation, so we don't have any laws or interpretations of the Charter that tells us what does it mean, you know. So I believe they will have a hard time proving that there was an imminent threat. Because even their contention is they're terrorists, and these are actions we're taking against terrorists that are we perceive to be a threat to us. And in that context, they say PKK, which has been labeled as a terrorist organization not just by Turkey, but also by the United States and the European Union, is one and the same as the Kurds, the YPG, and PYD. YPG is the armed faction of DYP, the party, the Kurdish party in northern Syria. Well, you need three things to justify it, even if they were an imminent threat. You need to show necessity, well, meaning no effective response was available other than use of force. Again, we can debate. We don't have enough time, so I'm not going to get into it. I'm just planting these. Necessity, was there any effective other ways for Turkey to do anything but invade Syria, another state? Proportionality, in other words, is what Turkey doing now, along with its factions, proportional to what the Kurds supposedly are doing or would be doing? And immediacy, that relates to necessity. And then did it have to be done when it was done? So, of course, we're saying all this. There is no real international court that's going to be trying all this. It might be somewhat philosophical, but at the same time, there have been international tribunals. There is actually a tribunal that's looking into the Syria in general by the UN. It's investigating. And this may fold under that jurisdiction, and that might, in essence, be something akin to a court process or some sort of an adjudication of whether or not what Turkey did is illegal and subject to any punishment. Otherwise, it's up to the Security Council, and you know what happened there. The vote, both Russia and the US were not in favor of taking any action against Turkey at this time for different reasons. The imminent threat versus actual attack has been expanded in part thanks, to what the United States was facing. Depends, of course, how you interpret it. If 9/11 was it was an actual attack, but it was an attack by a non-state faction. It was not a government that attacked us on 9/11. It was a non-state actor. But two resolutions were passed, 1368 on September 12, 2001, and 1373 on September 28, 2001, right after, confirming the United States' right of self-defense against terrorist groups that justified the invasion of Afghanistan and everywhere in the world. That's right. One, of course, important thing that relates to this also is, remember, Turkey invaded Syria, right? That's what our title says. Turkey didn't invade Kurdistan. Turkey did not invade northern Kurdistan. Turkey invaded an independent state called Syria. And it's not alleging that Syria has attacked it or Syria is an imminent threat to Turkey. So what's the justification? That's, again, subject to interpretation. But some scholars argue, and in some cases it's defended, that Syria was either unwilling or unable to act. So if a state is unwilling or unable to act, to defend itself, or to stop that threat that's posed to Turkey, then Turkey has a right to invade Syria. Well, again, I'm sure Mr. Assad may disagree with that. One on the legal part, I'll fold with this, and that sort of follows on what Dr. Muradian was talking about. The ultimate extreme interpretation of what's going on, or labeling it, would be that there's a crime of genocide is being committed. But you don't need to reach that. The question is there a crime against human rights? Is there a crime against humanity? Is claiming to secure a 20-mile deep and 300-mile wide territory of another state, another country, and removing its entire population, not just removing certain warriors, like removing the entire population, because it's the stated goal is to settle 2 to 3 million Sunni Syrians who are currently refugees in Turkey. So that means those who live there who are not Syrian Sunnis will have to be removed. They have to leave, either forced to flee, attacked by allied factions within Syria, and subject to do all sorts of human rights violations. That alone, moving a group of people from their land who belong there by tradition and by history, and removing them to another location, is a crime against humanity. And if you take it wider, you read the definition of genocide under the UN acceptances, a part of a group, even based on ethnic, religious grounds, to be relocated alone is one of the conditions or one of the factors that lead to a genocide. And we'll leave that again to future interpretations and actions. I just want to bring that to your attention. Now, let me talk a little bit. I'm asked to now talk a little bit about what's going on in Turkey, how this is perceived. This has brought basically almost every political faction other than HDP, which of course is considered to be maybe soon to be labeled same as PKK and subject to terrorist treatment, but hopefully not. But all political factions, all domestic opponents of the current government, their opponents, the divided groups, all of them, the main opposition and the second opposition, they're all united. They're only racing on how much they support what's going on with each other. This includes the CHP party, the Kemalist party, that recently had allied itself with the HDP in winning the city of Istanbul in the mayoral elections. And the mayor Imamoğlu was seen as this nice, futuristic, modern European leader who might bring things together. And his statements were as tough, if not tougher, than the government in support for the actions. Again, I mean, my view, this is my personal view, I believe the DNA of the CHP, compared to all parties, including the governing party, was much more closely related and is always related to CUP than any other party. And this is just, in my opinion, confirmation of that. No matter how, again, they may hold a glass of wine in their hands and dress better and talk environmentalism, feminism, all that stuff. But when it comes to, just having one nation, one unspoken but Sunni nation, and period, they're all united. I mean, the goals of the CUP leaders, I don't think have gone far away. And they're attacking, I mean, today I read that they attacked Erdogan for having cut the deal, if it's a deal, with the United States, because, his ministers and his personal assets were threatened by the sanctions. They go, see, when it comes to their personal belongings, all of a sudden they abandon our nationalistic and, important goals, and they fold. This is CHP, the Kemalist party. The Social Democrat, they'd like to call themselves. Of course, the other side, you have MHP, the Nationalist Party, who is, of course, all gung-ho about this. Again, even if, like as I said, even if it is true that there are some PKK elements, which probably is true, and they will explain, there are videos, even the Secretary of Defense under Obama at a congressional hearing did say PKK and YPG were both one and the same. So even if that's all true, I don't see how it's legally justified. So it leaves it to internal politics. Why is it being done? Well, one reason they say this is about unity. Turkish economy is going down. The leading party was supposed to split. That's one of the reasons. Of course, chilling effect on the Kurdish-CHP relationship. Maybe some say we were put on the spot, but we have no choice but to support, of course, our military. And we know from U.S. context, even opposition here, we always support the troops, we support the soldiers. But when you go beyond that, that's the overlap between supporting the cause and the objective and the troops. And in this case, there was no distinction. They were going all the way. Of course, the refugee problem, supposedly that's one of their justifications. There was only one Turkish voice that we heard that spoke against this. And he is under major attacks and he's under death threats. This is the president of the Northern Cyprus Republic, the self-declared Turkish Republic in north of Cyprus. And I forgot I had his name. But he said, because remember, the name of this invasion is Peace Spring. And usually names like that are used. So 1974, when Turkey invaded Cyprus, it was called the peace action for peace, again. And what he said is, he said that peace action in 1974, when Cyprus was invaded, Mustafa Akıncı, thank you, Mustafa Akıncı, was the elected president of, again, the Turkish Northern Republic of Cyprus. He said it was not a peace thing, it involved blood. And he said, this is not a peace spring. This is a spring where blood will run as well, about this invasion. And of course, he's called traitor. His own prime minister took against him. The government in Turkey said, look, you're a backstabber. Here we are helping you guys stay alive, and this is what you say. But he did say what he said without fear, and that should be mentioned. At least there is one leader in the Turkish world. Of course, there are other. I want to mention the reaction to the letter by Trump, because it is funny. We all laugh, of course, and there has been a lot of jokes everywhere about it. But Turkey, at least the Turkish establishment takes it very seriously, and they feel very offended. Not because they think there's a lot more beyond it than just Trump being Trump. Because if you read it, because Turkey, at least the officialdom of Turkey, presents itself to the world as a premier division team, right? We are in the G20, we are a respectable country, we have democracy. So when you get a letter, and Trump deals with certain people, like the North Korean leader, right? First he called him like a bunch of names, and then he starts, okay, maybe I'll get him to be my friend. I'll call him smart, I'll call him this. So the tone of the letter written to President Erdogan smacks of the kind of letter you would write to Kim, the leader of North Korea. And Turkey doesn't like that at all. Again, I don't know if that was done intentionally by Trump or not, but it is what it is. And also, of course, their reading leaves. We don't read much about it. There's big problems with Turkish alliance. No matter how much like Trump and Pence and Pompeo said, we're allied. There's a lot of friction going on, and Turkey is reading things that Pompeo was in Greece right before or right around the time this attack occurred, and they signed deals that had never signed with Greece before. They're expanding the U.S. bases in Crete. They are making the base agreements and all sorts of cooperation agreements with Greece permanent as opposed to being renewable year to year. And most important, the city of Alexandropoli, which is at the border of Turkey and Greece, in northern Greece, right when you enter Greece, which has no military bases, is going to have a U.S. base that's an Air Force base and a naval base to supply, Romania and Bulgaria. They're saying which is being supplied from Turkey these days. And as of course you hear about the Incirlik and the nuclear weapons and what's going on. So Turkey is looking, of course, they're claiming that they don't want this to impact the alliance with the U.S. and U.S. is saying the same thing, but we don't know. There's something going on, and Turks are reading all this, and they're interpreting, and they're taking their precautions. Of course, you read about the Halkbank, which is a bank that's related to the government in Turkey. They had indictments issued by the U.S. attorneys in Manhattan just yesterday regarding, again, the same issue, the money laundering involving Iranian gold and all that. But these are new, fresh indictments against Halkbank. Again, not good. Finally, the Armenian community. I mean, you read, I want to talk about, of course, we were going to talk about patriarchal elections and all that and the discrimination, but of course our topic changed. But one thing is, you read how the Armenian Patriarchate, along with the Jewish Grand Rabbi, issued statements that support the military action, praying for victory, and not only just for the safety of the soldiers. Of course, I guess, you could say they had to do what they had to do, but there are ways of, not doing it in the past. I remember Shinork Patriarch used to find different kinds of wording to express the same. I'm not sure if the Ecumenical Patriarch did issue a statement, but he probably did also. But the Armenian Catholic Archbishop didn't. And he simply said, look, we Catholics don't pray for war. We cannot support either side in a military conflict, but we do pray for peace, and we pray for peace every day. We hope there's peace. Well, maybe our patriarchate could have done the same as religious institutions. But of course, the pressure on Armenian patriarchate is much heavier than anyone else. I'm sure I've went over my time. So if there's any questions, we can take that, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Khachik and Edvin. If anyone has any questions, there's mics on the side. Feel free to ask any questions that you may have. Any questions? Okay. All right. Well, as a parting gift, we wanted to provide you all with the frames. So thank you so much, and please give a round of applause to Khachik and Edvin.